Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining me. This is episode 51 of Untold Evidence. Today, we blend a little bit of the more recent past into our overarching ancient past. Today, we're going to talk a little bit about some of the recent wars that have come across humanity. So you've probably heard these figures before. The Pentagon's own accounting puts the cost of the post-9/11 wars in Afghan, Iraq and Syria across 2 decades at roughly $1.5 trillion. Now that's the number cited in the budget hearings. That is a number reported on the evening news. And it could be wrong by about $6 trillion. Why it could be wrong is it only counts direct combat operations. It does not account for the interest paid on the borrowed money to fund those operations. It does not count for the long-term medical care for the wounded veterans, and it does not count for the disability compensation that is going to run for the next 50 years. When you do count those things, an academic project at Brown University, who have spent 15 years doing exactly this, suggests it is not 1.5. It's approximately $8 trillion. Now today, what $8 trillion actually bought, who paid for it, and who will keep paying for it for long after you and I are both gone. This is Untold Evidence, and this is episode 51, the first instalment of a special mini-series on the true cost of war. The Cost of War project was founded in 2010 at the Brown University's Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs, in collaboration with the Boston University's Pardaic Center. One of its co-founders is political scientist Netta Crawford. Its team has, over 15 years, included more than 60 scholars, economists, physicians, and human rights experts. Its methodology has been independently reviewed and is widely cited across policy literature. It is by consensus among defense economics as the most rigorous public accounting of the post-9/11 war in existence. Now here is what they found. From late 2001 through the fiscal year 2022, the United States appropriated and is obligated to spend approximately $8 trillion on the post-9/11 wars. That figure breaks down into $5.8 trillion in direct appropriations and at least $2.2 trillion in obligations to care for veterans over the wars in the coming decade. The bill is being paid for and will continue to be paid for by people who were children when the war started. The financial cost is the easiest number to grasp. The human cost is much harder. The Cost of War project's accounting estimates more than 900,000 direct deaths in the post-9/11 war zones. The figure includes more than 7,000 American service members, over 8,000 American contractors, more than 312,000 civilians, and over 250,000 opposition fighters, more than 1,300 journalists and humanitarian workers. The displacement figure is even more staggering. The project estimates that 38 million people have been displaced by the global war on terror, driven from their homes in Afghanistan, Iraq, Pakistan, Syria, Yemen, Somalia, and even the Philippines. That is more displaced people than were created by every war fought between 1900 and the year 2000, with the single exception of the Second World War. Here is where the accounting gets a little bit more uncomfortable. Between 2020 and 2024, well after the official end of the major combat operations in Afghanistan and Iraq, the United States Department of Defense awarded $2.4 trillion in contracts to private firms. That figure represents approximately 54% of the Pentagon's total discretionary spending in that period. More than half of every defense dollar since 2020 has flowed into private contractors. Now the top 5 recipients, you may not be surprised, Lockheed Martin being one, Raytheon, Boeing, General Dynamics, and the Northrop Grumman. These account for the bulk of the money. The Cost of War project has documented that since 2001, US military spending on the top 5 contractors alone has totaled roughly $2.1 trillion, not billion, trillion dollars. The methodology that made this accounting possible was pioneered by Joseph Stiglitz, Nobel laureate in economics, Linda Bilmes of the Harvard Kennedy School. In their joint 2008 book, The $3 Trillion War, they argued that the official Iraq war cost figures around $500 billion was off by a factor of 6. Their methodology, counting future veteran care, debt services, opportunity cost, and a macroeconomic drag, was the basis on which the Brown University Costs of War project was later built. Stiglitz and Bilmes were wildly criticised at the time for overcounting. 2 decades on, and their figures look like underestimates. And here's where the figure is the hardest to read. Since 2001, more than 130,000 American post-war veterans have died by suicide. The current rate by the Department of Veterans Affairs' own statistics is approximately 17 veteran suicides per day in the United States. This is more than 4 times the number of US service members killed in direct combat in the post-wars. The dead from these wars did not all die overseas. Most of them died at home. Most of them died after coming back. Most of them died from the wounds the budget figures do not list. This is part of the cost that does not appear in any GDP table or any contractor balance sheet, and it will keep arriving for decades. Independent labour economic studies have consistently found that military spending creates fewer jobs per dollar than almost any other form of federal investment. Approximately 5 jobs per $1 million in military procurement, compared with 13 jobs per million in education spending, 9 in healthcare, and between 7 to 8 in infrastructure or clean energy. Now, this is not an ideological claim. It is a labour multiplier calculation. Military spending pays well, but it employs few. The economic argument that war will stimulate the economy, the so-called military Keynesian that has shaped American politics since the Second World War, is by the data the weakest form of stimulus available for the federal government. Now here we go into the counter-narrative. The defenders of post-9/11 military spending argue, with some justification, that the absence of a successful follow-on attack on the American homeland after the 2001 attack represents a real outcome that the spending purchased. They argue that the nation-building efforts, however imperfect, prevented worse outcomes, and that without American intervention, terrorist sanctuaries would have proliferated. Now, these arguments do deserve a hearing. They are also, by 2026, harder to sustain than they were a decade ago. Afghanistan has returned to Taliban control, and it returned within weeks of the American withdrawal in 2021. Iraq remains politically fragile. Syria is partitioned. Yemen is in a humanitarian collapse. Some defenders also push back on the costs of war accounting itself, arguing that future veteran care obligations are speculative, that the indirect death estimates rely on contested epidemiological methods, and that the displacement figures conflate war refugees with economic migrants. Now we've got to take all of that seriously. Even if you accept the most conservative version of every contested figure, the post-9/11 wars cost the United States in direct appropriations alone more than $4 trillion. The most conservative version is still the largest sustained military expenditure in American history outside of the Second World War. In our next episode in this mini-series, we're going to look at how Iraq in particular was sold to the American public, what was claimed and what was known to be false at the time, as well as who knew it. For now, just sit with these figures. $8 trillion, 900,000 deaths, and 38 million people displaced. More than $1 trillion in interest already paid on the borrowing money, that funded the entire operations. Whatever you believed about these wars when they began, the question now is what we do with the bill, because the bill is still here. If you found this episode useful, please hit the like button, and as ever, any sort of commentary or questions, get them in the comments down below and we'll discuss them together. Thank you for watching episode 51, and we'll see you next time in episode 52.